Welcome back to Counting the Cost, your weekly business stop here on Al Jazeera. I'm Kamal Santamaria. Continuing our look at the IMF this week, and we turn to the future. As we've already seen, the group has this sort of image as a rich boys network that caters to the whims of rich nations. An image it'll probably need to cast off in these times where the developing world is assuming more importance. More on the IMF's future now with Sama El-Shahad in London.
Yes, Kamal, if there's ever been a comeback kid, then the IMF is it. 2 years ago, it was fighting for relevance in the world. Its advice was despised in poor countries, and even rich nations took little notice of it. But it's amazing what a crisis can do. Today, it's come back from the dead, charged with shaping the post-crisis world. Its managing director, Dominic Strauss-Kahn, seems to be saying all the right things, that developing countries such as China and India should have more of a say in how his fund does business. So has the IMF truly changed, or is it still a rich man's club? Nicole Johnston tracks the momentum for change.
This is the brave new world of global finance, led by the emerging markets, India, China and Brazil. The old G7, the group of finance ministers from the developed world, is dead, replaced by the G20. The West is shifting into the shadow of developing countries.
We can see potential shifts in power, in institutions, and international cooperation.
The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have met in Istanbul. Their legitimacy at stake, their relevancy under fire. The boardrooms of global finance are being forced to change.
This is a process that will take time. It will not happen overnight. We are reforming an organization that is complex, sophisticated, and reaching every corner of the world economy.
The IMF's ambition is to become a global central bank with a $1 trillion balance to lend to developing countries. But Malaysia's Minister of International Trade says its response to the crisis has been poor and its influence is waning.
We thought the IMF and World Bank would have come earlier to prescribe good policies. Obviously, they did not do that in good time. As a result, the situation became bad.
The World Bank is also bracing for a shake-up. It's long been accused of tying dubious economic reform to its loans. Reforms which frequently stifled local industries and allowed in cheap imports. It now has to reflect the shifting balance of power from the West to the East by giving the developing world greater voting power.
For as long as developing country views are not being heard by international bodies like IMF and World Bank, we're going to have policies which are lopsided, policies which are not fair, policies which do not take into account the interests of developing countries.
And now the developing world has another option. It can go to China for a loan instead of relying on the IMF. Out of date and out of ideas, the reign of the Group of 7 industrialised countries is finished. The global economic order has been turned upside down, and developing countries are now trying to steer the world out of this financial crisis. It could be a long journey. Nicole Johnston for Counting the Cost.
Joining me now is Anne Pettifor from the New Economics Foundation, and from Brussels, Andrea Maximovic from Solidar, to discuss the growing role of the IMF and whether it truly deserves it. Thank you, ladies, both for joining me. Now, Anne, let me start with you. The IMF was originally set up to prevent financial crises from taking place, but it didn't prevent this one, and it never even saw it coming. So why is it, despite this failure, that it's been given such a strategic, such a key role in the post-crisis world?
Well, I think it's just that the Europeans in particular need a fire brigade, if you like, to help them deal with the East European crises and with the crises of the countries on the margin of Europe, who were encouraged to borrow from richer countries inside Europe with unsustainable exchange rates, on the advice of the IMF and indeed of most mainstream economists. So I think what it is that the rich countries, the G20 countries, needed an agency to help them firefight these crises, and so the IMF was reinvented, if you like, for this purpose. And credit has to go to Dominic Strauss-Kahn for reorientating the IMF to a certain extent, but not to deal fundamentally with the economic theory that is so flawed and that led the IMF in the first place to fail to predict this crisis, to therefore fail to understand it and therefore fail to deal with it adequately.
Interesting point. And Andrea, let me bring you in here. Dominic Strauss-Kahn has been saying that the IMF now is changing, that it's no longer going to be the loan shark of the world or the bully boy for that matter. Should we believe him?
Look, I think it's very difficult to believe him if you're sitting where I'm sitting and you're working with some of the people who are experiencing the effects of the IMF loans. So if you're a teacher in Latvia whose salary has been cut by 40%, or if you're a poor person in El Salvador whose fuel subsidies have been eliminated, if you're in Pakistan and your electricity bill has gone up by 18%.
Let me come in here. These are loans that have been taken from the IMF since the beginning of this crisis. So these are recent loans.
That's correct. These are all recent loans. And it's true that the IMF has gone into some of these countries and done things like, for example, recommended the expansion of social safety nets. But that advice is contradictory in the extreme, when on the other hand, they are still saying things like you have to reduce your budget deficits to pre-level crises. Now, for some of these countries, they've been flexible in 2009, in the first year of the loan, but they expect them by 2011 to have these deficits reduced. And quite clearly what that means is just more government cuts to spending, and it leaves those people who are already suffering a lot under the effects of the crisis even worse off.
Yes.
And that's deeply hypocritical, because in October, November 2008, the IMF issued a statement urging governments to use taxpayer funds to bail out the finance sector. In other words, they urged governments, rich country governments, to engage in what's known as a fiscal stimulus, to use taxpayer money and to use money that was created but backed by taxpayers to flood the system with finance to prevent a systemic failure.
And it's what we've seen in America, it's what we've seen in Britain, everywhere.
Exactly, except in those countries that are debtor countries. They are obliged to do the very reverse. So these are profound double standards. And the reason for that is that the IMF's interests are not in the first place with those countries, their members, but with the finance sectors across, for example, Europe. So the Swedish banks that have lent rather unwisely to Latvian homeowners, or to the Austrian banks that lend to Hungarians and so on, are of much greater concern to the International Monetary Fund than the people of Latvia.
I'm very glad that Anne raised that point, because I think the question of who is actually behind the policies that the IMF is pushing is a key one. And I think that's the million-dollar question. I can tell you for sure that the 5% quota redistribution that the IMF Finance Committee announced in Istanbul a couple of days ago from developed to developing countries is not going to do a lot to fix the governance problem of the IMF. I think it's very important symbolically and in the interests of fairness that those countries are represented. But at the end of the day, it's quite clear, and if you read some of the statements by the European ministers, that what they really want is to give those countries a bit more of a say so they would invest a bit more money. I don't think that that will fundamentally change the kinds of policies that the IMF is used to prescribing.
And that's just about it for this week, but do let us know what you think. Of course, we're looking for your views on the IMF. Do you think it can adapt to meet the demands of developing nations? Head to aljazeera.net/English. Click on your views on the left-hand side of the page. You leave your comments there. And of course, while you're there, you can check in on all the business news at aljazeera.net/English. That's it from Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santa Maria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.